All right. Well, good afternoon, Kentucky Studies students, or good morning, depending upon when you're watching this. This is Mr. Cisco again, and we're just talking here about urban versus rural. So we're going to talk in this class today about urban versus rural dynamics and how do we define urban communities, how do we define rural communities, and why does this matter going forward? Remember, the question that I've been posing in class, as we've talked about community, Kentucky regions, is there one Kentucky or are there many Kentuckys? Be thinking about that. That's kind of one of our big guiding questions that you'll need to answer on the unit exams. We go through the geography of Kentucky. But urban versus rural is a major divide in our state. And today what we're going to talk about is what's the definition of these, along with suburban, talk about some of the challenges that are faced by this and where Kentucky's trending. And then after this, there'll be a small analysis that I want you to do and bring to class next week about urban and rural dynamics and kind of where Kentucky's going, and do you think this trajectory is good for our state? All right, so definitions. A urban area is an area that is often defined as a city or town with more than 2,500 people. So if you have over 2,500 residents in a city or a town, then according to the US federal government, you are defined as an urban area, okay? And so big urban areas we know of here in Kentucky. Think about urban areas that you know of. You might know Lexington, Louisville, of course, the biggest city in Kentucky, Covington, Lexington. As I said before, we know of more because we're in central Kentucky. Danville, which is close by here. Bowling Green out on the western side of the state. But again, you have a city or town more than 2,500 residents, you're an urban area. And the big thing about urban areas is that people are more concentrated than they are spread out. Okay, so you have more people living in maybe apartment complexes, more people in more dense surroundings than being spread out more, which happens in a rural area. Now, rural areas are often known as country areas, right? These areas with a lot of farmland or there's a lot of forest or something like that. But if you're living in an area that has fewer than 2,500 residents in that particular small geographic space, then that's a rural area. So you might be in a town, but if the town has less than 2,500 residents, then you're in a rural area according to the federal government. And here, it's the opposite, right, of an urban area in the sense that people are more spread out than they are concentrated. However, there is a third type of area, and this is an area actually the US federal government has never given a definition on, but most Americans say they live here. This is called a suburb. And a suburb is often a residential area that is outside of an urban area that people live and then commute to work in the big urban area. So, for example, where I lived in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, that was a town that was considered urban because it had about 7,000 people. But you could also classify that town as a suburb of Cincinnati because there were a lot of people that lived in that town that commuted up Interstate 75 every day to go work across the Ohio River in Cincinnati, and they actually lived in Kentucky. And so the thing is about these three different areas is that Kentucky features all of these. But one thing that makes the suburb stuff a little difficult is that without a definition from the federal government, we don't really know how many Americans live in suburbs. But as I said, when you poll Americans, I think the last poll of this was taken in 2018, about 52% or so of Americans said they lived in a suburb. But again, that's up to individual definition. But today we're only going to focus on urban versus rural, and we won't get into some of the suburb politics. So if you wanted to see kind of how Kentucky shakes out, like on a kind of a basis by town and things like this or suburb, you'll notice that the areas that are in red are rural. So you'll see that a good chunk of Kentucky, most of the state, is rural. The area that I'm from, as I said, up here in northern Kentucky, I was kind of living more in this kind of area, is a suburb, all right, or a small city. We see some of that kind of in central Kentucky near the Lexington area and some of the outgrowth to Nicholasville and things like this, into Woodford County as well. But then we also have urban areas, and you'll see a lot of that is concentrated near the Covington area, as I said, Lexington and Louisville. And we've got a kind of the beginning of an urban concentration also down here near Bowling Green, Kentucky, which is the home of Western Kentucky University. And so those are kind of the major things that are defined as urban areas in our state. But again, you'll notice we don't have a lot of urban areas. If we were looking at a map of, say, New York State, or we were looking at a map of something in the Northeast like Massachusetts, this would look a lot different than what we have here in Kentucky. However, regardless of whether you live in an urban or rural area, there are a lot of challenges that people are facing, and sometimes there's some similarities of challenges, and I've tried to keep them a little bit separate. But we'll talk about some similarities at the end of the slide. So there are some challenges for urban and rural areas, as I noted, and some of the challenges for urban areas, people that live in cities. Try to think of a couple off the top of your head. Pause the video for a moment. Think to yourself, what are some of the challenges maybe you think towns with more than 2,500 people might be grappling with? So if you did that, see how well this matches up. First of all, there's higher costs of living. You have more people that are living in a confined space, and so that means there's greater competition for goods and services. So that means that, for example, the cost of living is much greater. I remember when I went to New York City back in 2001, and so prices have risen over time. But I remember that here in Kentucky, about that time, to get a Big Mac was about $3, maybe been two. You went to New York City though, and to get a Big Mac cost about 9 or 10. And why? Well, because there's a lot more people there. So there's a lot more competition for goods and services, and prices can be higher to kind of distinguish who can pay for them and who cannot. Also, with more people living in an area, there's limited housing choices. So housing can sometimes be in short supply. This is an issue that's facing modern day New York City and Los Angeles and some of these bigger cities, is because they've grown so much, but you still have more people moving to them, and they don't have enough room to accommodate the people that want to live there. And that has created homelessness in some of these places. Also, drug addiction and crime have been problems in urban areas. I know that we talked about geographic stereotypes, that one of the stereotypes of living in an urban area is there's a lot of crime, but that has happened. And some of that comes from issues related to poverty that can exist in urban areas, also issues of hopelessness that exist in these areas, but also for those that are pushing drugs, there's a lot bigger of a customer base in the cities. And when crack cocaine, for example, was distributed a lot in the 1980s, it decimated a lot of cities that saw poor communities succumb to that epidemic. Also, with more people living in an area, you're going to have greater pollution. So you're going to have more air pollution. There's a lot of smog in Los Angeles, for example, because of all the automobile traffic. And some major cities in Europe actually are looking to ban automobile traffic. Paris is looking to do some of that, for example, so that they can reduce some of that pollution. But you're going to see not only pollution in the air, you're going to see pollution in water supplies potentially if you don't take care of it. Trash collection is going to be a bigger challenge. So those are issues that if you live in an urban area, you've got a lot of attractions, you've got a lot of jobs, you've got a lot of things to look forward to, but you also have challenges when you're living among that many people. And like, for example, when you have a big epidemic like COVID, you're going to have higher numbers in urban areas because people are in closer contact. Now, in a rural area, there are also challenges, and you can pause the video or just think to yourself really quickly, what might be some of these challenges? But a lot of areas here in Lincoln County are rural, so let's talk about those. Geographic isolation is one of them. And geographic isolation can lead to feelings of depression. It can lead to feelings of hopelessness. Some people like being out there, living on their own homestead and not having to worry about other people. But sometimes that's not always the case. And some of that isolation can lead to boredom. It can just lead to not a lot to do. And some people don't like that as much as living in an urban area. There's also limited access to things like healthcare and the internet. That's one of the issues, right? We've seen during digital learning is that some of your classmates, sadly, right now, and you might be watching this video because you don't have internet, all right? And that's one of the byproducts of living in a rural area. And it's not necessarily your fault you don't have it, but the fact is that a lot of businesses don't want to invest in giving internet service and fast speed internet service to a lot of rural areas because they argue that there's not enough customers there for them. And it's not economical for them to build all the infrastructure. So, in one of the big disputes now with the federal government is should the federal government pay business to put that together? So, something to think about. Also, healthcare can be harder to obtain simply because you're living farther away from it. And this leads to the fact that sometimes you have poor healthcare outcomes because people live farther away from hospitals and other doctors to get the kind of care that they need. Also, education outcomes tend to be poorer in rural areas, often because of the limited economic resources and opportunity that's present. Because education systems are funded in this state partly by the government, the state government, but often by your local tax base. And if you don't have a lot of bigger businesses and others that operate within your county or within your town or area, you don't have as much money to put into your education systems. But let's make no mistake about it. There are a lot of challenges that urban and rural areas both face. They both face healthcare issues in some ways. They just maybe have different ways of dealing with it. But there are issues like dealing with drugs. Like drug addiction is also something I could have put in rural areas, especially the opioid epidemic has devastated a lot of areas that are rural in eastern Kentucky. Okay. And so that is something that the state has had to think about. So the challenges that rural and urban areas face are in many ways somewhat the same, but we have to nevertheless keep in mind that there are some differences between the two. Now let's talk about Kentucky's urban and rural divide. Like, where does this put Kentucky going forward? Well, first of all, if you look at politics, and this is kind of mirroring a national trend, but what's happening is that in urban areas, you tend to see more Democrats and you tend to see more Democratic votes. Okay. And it seems that the modern day Democratic Party finds a lot of its support in cities, whereas the Republican Party tends to have a lot more of its following now based in rural areas. And that wasn't always the case. Like if you looked 50, 60 years ago nationally, Republicans had a little bit of a better following in the cities, and Democrats had much better, especially here in Kentucky, following in rural areas. But that's kind of shifted over time as topics of concern have changed. For example, in the 2016 presidential election, the only two counties of Kentucky that President Trump did not win were Jefferson County, which is where Louisville is, and Fayette County, which is where Lexington is. Everything else, Trump won. We'll look at a map of that in a moment. If you look at population patterns, Kentucky is becoming more urban. Like if you look at our population growth, as I put down here, between 2010 and 2017, Kentucky grew by 2.4% in terms of its population. But the areas that attracted this population movement were urban areas. People were not moving from urban areas to rural areas. In fact, the opposite has been true. And as another example of that, like for example, during that time, Scott County grew by 15.9%. And Scott County is where you see a lot of Toyota plants. The Japanese automaker Toyota started investing in Scott County during the governorship of Martha Lane Collins, our only female governor. And that's brought a lot of jobs to Scott County, but it's grown a lot. Also, people work in Lexington and they prefer to be in Scott County, so that's there. But Lee County, which is a rural county in eastern Kentucky, the population out there fell by 14.9%. So again, urban Kentucky going up, rural Kentucky going down. And people blame that on jobs, they blame it on opportunities, etc. But there are a lot of implications of where we head going forward, whether we're going to be more urban or more rural. We'll talk more about this in class. But be thinking about a couple of questions. Okay? Be thinking about something. If Kentucky becomes more urban, is that good? And how does that shift the state's priorities, politics, concerns? If more people in Kentucky start living in cities and the votes for politicians are found in those cities, and the cities are the ones that people have to win in order to become governor and senator and things like this, does rural Kentucky get left behind? Do the concerns of rural Kentuckians become less important? And that's something to be thinking about. So what I want you to do is that there is a brief reflection piece, and it's just a reflection piece where I want you to think about it. Do you think Kentucky's better served by being more urban, or do you think we're better served by being more rural? Okay. And you can base that off of your own experiences. You can base it off of the information, of course, I've provided here. But I just want you to reflect on that question because, again, what we're going to be doing in class, we're going to come back, we're going to talk about this question of urban versus rural next week. And then we're going to start looking at some data that can spell out, is it good for Kentucky to move in a urban rural direction? And how might some policies differ among state officials based on these divides? All right. So I hope everybody has a great week. I will see you in class on Thursday, and I look forward to talking about these issues. Have a great day.